Welcome to the Women Leading on Climate podcast. I'm your host, McKenna, and today we're going to speak about holding governments to account, as well as companies, through litigation. And I'm going to start off with someone who's pretty awesome. She's a young woman who I've known for over a decade, so she was pretty young when we first met. And she is very brave, and she is really pushing hard to hold governments accountable. Hey, Sophia, how's it going?
Hi, I'm doing well. How about you?
I'm good. It's back to school, and you are really back to school. You're just started university.
Yeah, it's been pretty crazy this week, but I'm really excited to start this new chapter of my life.
It's great. So you have left Sudbury now, and now you're at the University of Ottawa. So what are you studying?
I'm studying economics and public policy, so definitely relevant, and I'm excited to be in Ottawa, a bigger city, and see how that's different from Sudbury and the sort of change I can make here.
Okay, so you and I met quite a long time ago. How old are you? You're now like 18? Is that right?
Yeah, 18.
So we met when you were a climate activist. I think you were like 10 or 11. Well, where was it? Can you remember where we met?
Yeah, we met at the Al Gore prequel for his movie. And I remember I was kind of waiting for you, and I was waiting to meet you. And I was really excited, and you came up to me, and I talked about my story and how I was as an activist and the things I was doing. And you came up to me and you made a pinky promise with me, actually, promising that we would both do our part to protect the environment. And I think that was a major start point for my own individual activism. Instead of, going to events or lobbying, that's when I felt like I actually started protesting and going out and making my own difference and following up with that pinky promise.
Well, it's really awesome. I feel like we both, held up our ends of the bargain, still working on climate, but maybe you could just talk, it was so amazing when I met you because you were so young and you were already doing stuff on climate. So maybe talk about your journey, because you're now like leading the way and holding government accountable.
Yeah, so climate change had always been like a topic of discussion at, the dinner table. My grandfather was an IPCC scientist, and my mother is a lobbyist for climate change and environmental change. So, it's always something that I was aware about growing up, but I kind of assumed, because it was something that I always heard about, that it was something being solved. But then one time when I was 8 years old, my mom was going off to lobby, and usually my dad would take me to a museum or something like that. But I was curious. I was like, I want to know what my mom does. So she brought me along on her lobbying journey, and meeting after meeting, I started to realize that she was trying to convince politicians to protect my future, to take action. That's when I started to realize that, wait, they aren't protecting my future. We aren't doing enough to protect me and save us from climate change. And I think that's where I really started. So I started going lobbying, myself. And obviously at 8 to 10 years old, I'm not, listing off policies. I was drawing photos and giving them to politicians about the animals they should protect. And then later on in my own city, I started a campaign to get rid of plastic straws, stop automatically handing them out at restaurants. And then obviously in 2018, when Greta Thunberg posted on Twitter about her Fridays for Future action, I knew I needed to do that, especially as a youth that had been to all these events, been lobbying, done things in my city. That was mainly adults. And finally seeing a youth, a Gen Z youth speaking up and saying, hey, why don't we go out and protest? Why don't we miss out on school and protect our future? I thought that was amazing. And I think that was kind of the lead up to where I am now.
And it was amazing because you protested and you got a lot of young people. Like I remember seeing in Sudbury, there are a lot of young people that are coming out. Is that right?
Yeah, we were the first outside of Europe to start striking here. Well, not here in Sudbury now, but in Sudbury. And yeah, I think there's a lot of youth out there that really wanted or at least want to take action on climate change and want to do something. But it's really hard to make those initial steps because, I have the privilege of having parents that, have lobbied, or having people in my life that are resources to start protests. So being able to be that resource for others, so then now they can go to these events and speak up for what they care about. And, I get to be, something that helps them do that is great, because I think the hardest part about activism, the hardest part about speaking up is like actually going out and doing it. Because there are so many youth out there that I know are very concerned about climate change, but don't know what to do.
Well, now you've moved on. I mean, you're probably still protesting and going to events, but you've decided that it's time to hold government accountable. And you brought a lawsuit against the government of Ontario, the Ford government, for backtracking on their climate commitments. Talk a bit about that, because I think I'm a lawyer, and I find this is really interesting, that this is actually saying, we have rights, they need to be protected, you need to act, and if you aren't, then you need to be held accountable.
Yeah, so I think, most of my activism career leading up to that being protests, it kind of feels like a lot of the time it's like yelling at or speaking to politicians or to people that make actions that determine our future and determine, what we do about climate change, and they can just ignore it. They don't have to say anything. They don't have to make a public response. But when it comes to going to court and, actually going through a legal process, they have to make a response. They have to make a counter argument, and it has to be public. People are seeing what they're saying. So I think that, in all aspects of every career, we have to combat climate change. And I think in law specifically, it's really important because that also leaves precedent that, they have to continue to take action no matter what government it is. And then we can also use that precedent for future cases. And I think that that's really important. I find it really cool how, like, law and how different important careers in our world can impact how we act on climate change. And although I think protesting is really important, I think combating climate change from all these angles, from government to legal to just social things, is really important to getting the change that we want.
I love it. I love that you are thinking about all the different angles. I'm always thinking about that. Okay, what's the theory of change? Okay, how do we actually hold folks accountable? And I do think that these lawsuits are important. You were the first citizen-led lawsuit, but it was all young people. That's pretty cool. So where's the law? Where's the litigation at now?
Well, the thing about cases is that it takes a long time. So for more court hearings soon. We're going to get our case reheard. I think in November-ish. I'm not entirely sure about the date. But yeah, that's the one thing about cases like these, is that there's definitely small victories along the way of, judges agreeing with certain things that we say, but, we're going to push it to another court, and then we're going to push it to another court. So although it's really important, it does take a long time, and that's why I think it's really important that, the organization I'm doing it with, Eco Justice, continues to do things along the way. Like, we have many events with people where they can learn about the case and about how climate change relates to law and how our government's action is really important.
Well, I think your voice is really key. I mean, I certainly hope you win, but as you say, you've had victories along the way. And also, you're just making a really practical case that climate change is having a real impact on young people, on their mental health, but also it threatens their physical health. And as you said, it's life, liberty of the person. It increases the risk of death. And we got to keep it real here. So good luck with that. We did have an exciting decision that I'm sure you paid attention to. So the recent International Court of Justice opinion that says that countries can be held accountable for their targets and for continuing to, push fossil fuels. So what did you think about that? Were you cheering?
Yes, I think that that's really amazing, and I think that definitely follows our case and a lot of cases around the world that are happening, against governments. And I think that this will definitely help for future cases and help the argument. And a lot of the evidence used in that is similar evidence that many of the cases around the world are using. So I think that that's really important. Just having that statement is having an understanding that we need to take action on climate change and that governments aren't doing enough is something that shouldn't be that hard to argue in court. And I think that that's definitely helping us and hopefully helping any future cases that are coming.
Well, I think it's awesome, and it's also great to see it's the Pacific Islands, led by Vanuatu, who are saying, like, literally, we're going to be underwater, so you need to be acting. So it's also accountability for and ensuring that those who are the most vulnerable are protected. So anyway, I just think it's awesome. So you better go, because you probably have to go back to class.
Yes, I do. First week of school, but it was really nice meeting with you and talking to you.
Well, you know what? Just keep me updated. I'm there with you in spirit, and I know you inspire so many young people, but you also inspire women that are a lot older like me. So I'm glad we did that pinky promise many, many years ago, and just keep on going.
Yes, I can't wait to keep up with that pinky promise.
Awesome. Wow, that was so amazing talking to Sudbury activist, climate activist Sophia Mathur, who I met when she was about 10 or 11, now starting off at university, still pushing hard on climate, using litigation and going after the Ford government. It's pretty awesome. I can't wait to see what she does. Now I'm going to go to someone who's out of university a few years, like me. It's Laura Clarke. She's the CEO of Client Earth, but I think I probably met her when she was High Commissioner, the UK High Commissioner in New Zealand, very focused on climate. And she's just amazing. She's been pushing hard on climate. She's Time 100's climate list, and she is just an awesome woman using litigation and the law to protect life on Earth and get transformational change. And as a lawyer, I totally support holding governments and major polluters accountable. Laura, it's great to see you.
It's great to be with you, Catherine, and lovely to connect again. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's awesome. You know, I feel so lucky because Women Leading on Climate, I get to pick some of my most inspiring women that are out there that are working hard on climate, and you are definitely one of them leading the way. So let's start on how are you doing? Well, first of all, it's back to school for both of us, so we had to survive that. So you can talk about that. But it's also just a hard time on climate.
Yeah. It is. It's really hard. And it is back to school. And actually, after a while, that's a relief. You sort of send the kids off to school and then you can sort of roll up your sleeves again. But it is tough at the moment. I mean, we're properly living in a time of climate and environmental consequences, aren't we? You know, we see the floods in Pakistan, the fires in Spain. The UK has just had its hottest summer ever. And yet we sort of see inertia, we see reversal from lots of leaders around the world. So it does feel bleak, but I call myself a determined optimism, and I do see opportunity, right? I do, we know what we need to do in terms of tackling the climate crisis. You know, we've got the science, we've got the technology, we've largely got the policies. And so for me, it's about how do you shift mindsets and how do you tackle the inertia that is really a result of the vested interest of the status quo, and the law, which is what I work on, is a really useful tool in doing that.
So let's go into the law, because I've been thinking about this a lot. Like at one point, everyone was making these net zero pledges. You know, they have their climate targets, not ambitious enough, but supposed to live up to them. And now we see governments and we see businesses backing away. And there's real consequences. Now, one thing that is actually interesting is how attribution has gotten much closer and much better. So we can actually show that, events are much more likely because of the climate crisis fueled by fossil fuel companies. So how do you see the law as a tool, and how does Client Earth use it?
Yeah. So the law used in the right way can get us to some positive tipping points earlier. It can really accelerate that positive action that we need for the planet. And at Client Earth, we work across the full life cycle of the law. So we try and get the right laws and regulations in place. Sometimes we draft laws for governments, we work on regulatory reform, because if you change the laws, you change the rules of the game and how people and companies behave. We also litigate. So that's what we're most known for. We do these big cases against governments, against corporates, those that are polluting, those that are not taking the right action. And a legal case can be important. It can bring systemic change, because it's important in terms of the individual situation at hand, but it can also set precedent. It can change mindsets and behaviors. So we've had lots and lots of big legal cases against companies and governments. And then the third thing we do, which I think is so important, is what I call building the field. So we train judges, lawyers, prosecutors, work with community groups, so that more and more people globally are using the law to defend the environment and uphold their rights. And I think in this time of political polarization, the more people that feel they have agency to affect change and that might be using the law to do that, that's so important to avoid defeatism, to avoid that polarization and really try and shift the dial.
I really think it's really an important tool, and it can be regular people. So when I talked to Sophia Mathur, she and a group of youth activists working with one of our environmental organizations, one of the leading ones, were able to bring this litigation against the government and really show that young people, it is about their rights, all young people's rights. It doesn't matter, that you're really powerful, and you are taking action against the most powerful governments, major polluters. But let's talk in real terms. So, you're going to have wins in law, you're going to have losses. So maybe let's start with the wins. Like, what do you see as some of the major cases that you've been involved with or you're watching that have really moved the dial and created important precedents, important outcomes?
So there are a number here. I'll sort of give a couple of examples. One is the work that we've been doing to tackle climate obstruction. Lots of people will have heard of greenwashing. So, false narratives about how green a product or a service is. And we've had a huge number of cases about greenwashing in aviation, greenwashing in fossil fuels. So with the first aviation greenwashing case was last year against KLM. And that's really important, because it's saying it's not okay to just go out and tell lies about how sustainable your product is, because greenwashing, it breeds complacency, it undermines the action that's needed. And Client Earth has done a lot on that front with our greenwashing files. We have one case underway against Total Energies in France, but there has been a proliferation that has really closed that space, what used to be a wild west, for those false green claims. And we've combined that with advocacy, with sharing our intellectual property. Then I think another really interesting vein is the human rights angle on climate action, which is very powerful. So in the European Court of Human Rights last year, there was the Klimasenjorinnen case, the senior Swiss women who argued that the Swiss government's inaction on climate, or inadequate action on climate, was a violation of their human rights. That's just one example of a number of cases that are bringing that human rights angle in. We just won a case in Spain, supported a case saying that pollution from industrial pig and poultry farming was a violation of the rights of the communities living there. And the court said that very clearly that a healthy environment is independent with human rights. And so I think that's a really useful avenue for pushing governments to do more, because governments understand they have to look after their people, and if they're not ensuring a healthy environment, they're not looking after their people.
Well, I think that both are really interesting focuses. Obviously, as the chair of the UN Secretary General's high-level expert group on greenwashing, really, it was, you really see that a lot. And as you say, we do need to hold companies accountable, because they actually are making money. They're making profits. A lot of people want to invest, put their money with banks. They're actually putting the money towards the clean transition. They want to work for companies that care about climate. They want to spend money, buy products that are actually good for the environment. And if they can use real dollars and cents or real action that can have an impact, but they're being fooled. And then, of course, it creates this illusion that a particular company is very good, but also that we're making way more progress than we are. And we got to make a lot more.
Absolutely. It creates an uneven playing field for those that really are making the effort. And it's not just, we brought a complaint against BlackRock as well for greenwashing of finance, advertising sustainable funds. And I think one of the interesting things next is what I call the under the radar enablers of the fossil fuel status quo, right? So it's
I've been thinking about this, so talk about this. I actually think that this is, maybe fossil fuel companies are fine. They're just going to continue to fight the litigation, but it's everyone around them. So tell me about this.
Under the radar enablers. So you can't build a new oil pipeline, say, without the insurance in place, without the lawyers to do the contracting, without the consultancies, without the PR and advertising agencies. All of that, adds up to perpetuate this very, very damaging status quo. And so we've taken part, with UN Race to Zero and others on some really good work on what's called serviced emissions for professional services industry, to really understand, well, what are their responsibilities? Who are they working for? How can they influence them? Should they be working for them? Do you want to, as an advertising company, be working for Saudi Aramco, for example, and then bringing lots more money into continued fossil fuel extraction? So I think that's quite an interesting vein that will be more, will become much more of a thing as the spotlight starts to shift to people saying, well, look at all your responsibilities, and it's not enough to just say, oh, well, I've got solar panels on my roof. It's who are you working for, and therefore what are you responsible for?
So, if people really want to go to the UN high-level expert group report, Integrity Matters, we do talk about those that are, maybe are also making net zero claims. A lot of accounting firms, a lot of law firms, a lot of, advertising firms, they make these amazing claims, but they're net zero, and then they go enable people, enable the major polluters. But I think this is a really good, and I'm really quite into this, because having worked in big law, lawyers are always writing these briefs about risk. And I don't think that they are fully understanding the risk to their clients. That there's the infrastructure risk, that there's actually the risk of, physical damage, but also there's massive litigation risk, and that goes beyond fossil fuel companies. And I think that once you don't even have to win cases. You need lawyers to understand, oh no, our clients are at risk of this litigation that will cause terrible publicity, but it also could result in very significant damages. And as I say, as attribution science gets closer, as governments have no ability to pay for the damages caused by climate crisis, this is coming. So everyone, if you're a lawyer out there, I would start briefing your clients about this, and you will then see behavioral change.
Absolutely. So let's talk about, because you asked about attribution science earlier, and I didn't respond to that point. This is a huge and exciting development. The attribution science is improving all the time. There was a really interesting article about it in Nature just a couple of months back. Maybe
unpack it, just in case people don't know what we're talking about.
Attribution science is essentially the science that enables you to say that the emissions from a certain company, let's say it's a fossil fuel company, can be linked to certain climate impacts, whether that's extreme weather, whether it's sea level rise, temperature rise, and that's really, really important. Now, there was a case earlier this year brought by a Peruvian farmer, Luya, against RWE, the German energy firm, and he was essentially saying that RWE should pay for some of the damage done to his farm by glaciers melting as a result of climate change. And there was a calculation of what was the certain percentage of emissions that RWE was responsible for, and therefore what damages should they pay to him. Now, interestingly, the court didn't agree that RWE should pay him damages, but they did confirm that a corporation can be held accountable for damage caused by its emissions. And so it's only a matter of time before you start getting cases, and they might be class actions cases, damages claims, when communities and broad groups of communities come together and say, look at the damage that has been done to our community, our economy, our way of life, that's directly attributable to this corporate, company. Let's say it's an oil firm, and therefore we need damages. Now, when those damages claims scale, as you say, Catherine, that really changes the business model. It changes the calculation. And I think that's really what we're trying to do across the board with some of this litigation, is change the calculations. And we have a really interesting case underway in the US at the moment, in Colorado, on behalf of some Colorado landowners, which is tackling the fact that big oil companies evade their asset retirement obligations, by which I mean when an oil well comes to the end of its life, you need to plug it. You need to make it safe and make the area around it safe. But there are 2.1 million unplugged oil and gas wells in the US, leaking methane into the environment, damaging the local communities. And that's because the owners, the big oil companies and gas companies, they own it, they make the profit, but towards the end of the life of the oil well, they sell it to another company, and then that company goes bust. So it's a bankruptcy, it's a fraud, essentially. And so what we're trying to do is shift that accountability, because if you then have to factor in those cleanup costs into your business model, that changes the bottom line. And if you can no longer just pass off the pollution, and just think about your own profit, that changes the whole system.
I mean, it's really interesting because I think in Canada, it's not just plugging oil wells. So if you think of the oil sands, I'm always appalled because it's just an economic case. The unfunded liabilities associated with, this is before they sell them off or go bankrupt or close down or who knows what, are massive. And you wouldn't, as I try to explain to people, and it's always hard because sometimes, you got to put it in real life terms. I was like, if I just decided to take all my garbage and throw it out on my lawn and just say, sorry, too bad, that would not be okay. So why is it okay for oil and gas companies to, in the case of the oil sands, it is massive tailings ponds that are having a huge impact on indigenous communities often right now. And they aren't required to put up the money to clean them up. So who's going to pay for it? It's going to be us.
It falls on the taxpayers. And so it's about, sometimes we talk about these things as stolen subsidies, right? Because these companies end up, and they end up having their mess cleaned up by the taxpayer. And so really what we're trying to do collectively is make a reality of the polluter pays principle, so that you're really changing that. So those negative externalities have to be accounted for, and then you're changing the economic model.
I mean, it's kind of ironic, though, because I find that often, conservative politicians, small c conservative politicians, or now they're kind of more right-wing politicians would probably be a better description. In theory, they agree with the polluter pay principle. It's a market-based, it's just like, if you're going to pollute, you got to pay. But they don't want to implement it. And then we're not only subsidizing, we have all these unfunded liabilities, and then there are damages. So this is why I do think litigation is extremely important, because it's just holding people accountable. And I think polluters and governments accountable. Okay, so let's take a little bit of a break and talk about, it's heavy. It's heavy right now. We talked about it in the beginning. It's hard. Plus, we're moms. So, it can be heavy having kids. All the moms out there, more power to you. And yes, back to school can be quite exciting. Also challenging, because then you got to make sure they're taking the right classes and everything's
getting
okay.
On the right bus.
Getting on the right bus, lunches, all those things. But what do you do to get away from it all? We got a lot going on. I always tell people, and they're probably sick of it, but I love swimming. So I try to get to open water if I can. Sometimes it's freezing here, so I go to a pool. But What do you do to get away from it all?
So I'm at my happiest when I'm on top of a mountain, when I've climbed up a mountain. But sadly, life and work and kids and living in London means I'm not on a mountain, at every opportunity. But I love to get outside, whether that's running or swimming, just being active to really clear my head. And then I think it's really important to just find joy in the day-to-day. Kids, friends, food, theatre. I love going to the theatre. I love film, and at work as well, because this stuff is heavy, right? We're going deep into these existential challenges of what's happening to our environment and our climate. We've got the leadership challenges. If you're in a non-profit like me, you're constantly worrying about bringing the money in, and keeping it's on and keeping, paying your colleagues. So finding ways to find of levity, of joy and having fun is really, really important. So that's been a bit of a focus for me recently. If I go on a trip, now my kids are a little bit bigger, I went to China for the first time ever because we have an office in China. And in the past, when my kids were younger, I'd always go, do my work, fly straight home, get back to the kids because that mum guilt was too high. And then when I went to China last year, I was like, no, I'm going to add a day on. Went to the Great Wall with my colleagues. And it was so amazing. And so it's about how do we live within everything else that's going on, and make the most of it and find those times to balance the heaviness with a bit of levity.
I think that's great. I have a book coming out, Run Like a Girl, and I do talk about, go into a chapter, you can read all the details of carbon pricing, anything you wanted and I didn't want to know. And then I also talk about just when things were getting really tough, calling up my girlfriends and saying, come over for chips and wine. I do an SOS. I'd be like, SOS, come over tonight. Or we would go out dancing. And I just thought, these are things that are still important. You're still allowed to have fun. And in fact, if we don't have fun, then how are we going to get up the next day and continue doing the hard work?
Yeah.
Okay, so less fun is losing, because you don't always win. So maybe talk about, just be honest about, a case that you lost. But I think there's always a silver lining because often you're making some advances. There's some precedent even in a case you can lose. But maybe just talk about that because I think we got to keep it real. We don't always win. You're not going to win every piece of litigation you bring. And maybe that's not always the point.
Yeah. Failure is so important, and we, at Client Earth, we're always trying to push the envelope to bring cutting edge litigation. We sort of actively try and foster a culture of courage, being willing to experiment and fail, and innovate, because otherwise you're not making progress, right? If it's always comfortable, you're probably not making progress. So probably our most prominent failure is a big case that we brought a couple of years ago against the board of directors of Shell. And we brought this as shareholders. It was a derivative action, so we brought it as shareholders of Shell, essentially saying that the board of directors were not acting in the best interests of the company because they weren't doing enough to manage climate risk. And so we were saying they weren't doing enough to manage that long-term commercial viability. And this was a question of essentially fiduciary duty. Now, sadly, the court declined to hear that case in substance. It didn't get past the permission stage, but the judge did confirm the materiality of climate risk. And what was interesting about that case, that was very high profile, that failed at the first stage, was quite how much pickup it got, even though it failed. And so we know it was talked about in boardrooms around the world, in conferences of general counsels. There was a former Supreme Court judge in the UK wrote a very influential article saying how this was a missed opportunity for the courts to grapple with the responsibility of company directors in the context of the climate crisis. And so I think you said this earlier, you don't always have to win a case to start changing those mindsets and behaviors. That spectre of liability can be hugely powerful, both in terms of, getting the laggards to up their game, but also encouraging those that really want to seize the advantage of the business models of the future to really lean into that.
So I just, Laura, I'm just gonna, the sound has changed a little bit. Maybe if you came a bit closer. I think that was okay,
Yeah,
but
okay.
I don't know if, I think that's a bit better. I don't know. It's hard. Like
Yeah.
sometimes it goes in and out. That was very good. That was very good. Okay, just I'm gonna that we'll clip that.
Okay, good.
Okay, so there was a really big case that just happened. The whole world was paying attention. Vanuatu in the Pacific Islands, an area that you know, a region
Yeah.
you know well, brought a case to the International Court of Justice. So maybe can you talk about that? Why it's important and what you think this means for the future of, litigation and holding governments accountable.
Yeah, it's such an inspiring and important case. So this started, amazingly, it started in a classroom, bunch of students in Fiji, Pacific Islands students for climate change action. It was their initiative originally that they said we need to go to the highest court in the world, the ICJ, and ask it for an advisory opinion on what states' obligations are to tackle climate change. It was then
I love it. Young
it was
people.
brilliant. It was young people rule. And, it's amazing from a climate justice perspective, right? Because they're from the South Pacific, which is one of the most climate vulnerable regions, and they're young people, right? And we know that climate is going to impact young people, future generations. And so it was their initiative. Vanuatu picked it up and ran with it, pushed it at the UN General Assembly to get a resolution asking the ICJ to do this advisory opinion. But it really built this amazing momentum from states, from civil society, and beyond. And as you say, the ICJ in July came out with its decision, and it was a unanimous decision, which is unusual, and it was incredibly forward-leaning around the responsibilities of states to take action on climate change under international law, that states have to do all they can to stay within 1.5 degrees, that it's not a question of discretion, it's a question of due diligence, and there's a really important part also on human rights and a healthy environment being a precondition for the enjoyment of human rights. I mean, I could go on. You can tell I'm very enthusiastic about it. It's really, really important. And what's the significance now going forward? Well, firstly, there's that, it's a very, very authoritative articulation of climate change obligations under international law. That's really important because when any judge in a regional court, in a national court is hearing a climate case, it will have this decision. The judge will have this decision on their desk to refer to, because it's a very, very clear articulation of what the obligations and responsibilities are. It's really important as an advocacy tool in the run-up to COP30 in Belém, as countries everywhere are having to look at their nationally determined contributions, think about what their responsibility is. And it will absolutely, strengthen those community groups, litigant organizations like ours that are trying to push governments to do much more. And I think the other thing, and everyone's still unpacking exactly how is it going to influence some of these issues, but it's also very clear about what states' obligations are in terms of regulating non-state actors. And so what should you be doing for businesses in your country? How should you be regulating them? What should be allowed? And I think there's probably something interesting, and it's not my area, around the interplay between this decision and investor-state dispute settlements, for example, where you get this bizarre situation where fossil fuel companies can sue states for their climate action because they say that they had an expectation about continued ability to make profit from the fossil fuel investments. So anyway, it's a very long answer and probably overly enthusiastic, but it's an exciting development that really should provide a really useful framing for the months and years ahead.
Well, I think that these decisions, it's step by step. With Sophia was talking about how long often these cases take, but they matter. And we need to keep on pushing. So there's all these women out there around the world who are, pushing hard, but we're also trying to say, okay, here are some areas where we think there are some real opportunities in Canada. So the Canadian chapter has, said to securities regulators, like, you need to actually be taking disclosure seriously. You should be requiring it. And I think people are looking at fiduciary obligations. So I think it's really good that you talked about shareholders saying, wait a minute, like, you have obligations to us. And we need to be pushing that. But where do you think there are some real opportunities? And it could be training more people. I was thinking, like, there's so many awesome women, lawyers, judges that are, that care about climate. But I think knowing the tools, and sometimes in Canada, we're less aware in your own legal system of what's going on around the world, but they can be used. They may not be decisive factors, but they can be used in litigation. So where do you, if you're talking to the woman, man, whoever's listening to this, what would you say you think there's some real opportunities for practical action?
I think, there's a lot, right? So you're stepping back from the law for a moment. How can people feel that they have more agency? How can you get involved in things like energy communities? I don't know if you've got those in Canada, but in Europe, that's an increasing thing where you get local communities who own and are responsible for renewable energy provision. So that democratization of energy provision, for example, is really, really important. Using power as citizens, as consumers, where you hold your pension, for example. And then, I do think the law as a tool, legal environmental activism is becoming much more mainstream. You were just speaking to Sophia. We've talked about the senior Swiss women. We've talked about the Fiji students bringing this case. At Client Earth, we work with community groups suffering the effects of air pollution. We're working with landowners, struggling with unplugged oil wells. We're working with community groups struggling with the pollution of industrial agriculture. So I think there is a really important thing around, education, awareness, who can you go to for support? What are the organizations? What makes a really, a powerful advocacy campaign or legal case to really shift the dial? And I think that's so important because in this time of polarization, and there are those that try and say, well, if you want environmental action or climate action, you're in one part of the political spectrum. That's rubbish, right? It's not political to want to drink clean water and breathe clean air. But it's really important that these changes that we need, the transition that we need, is not seen as being done to people. It's that people feel that they've got their arms around it and they have agency and they're driving change. So how do people get involved? And there are practical things as well. The sort of local gardens, the planting. I just think, being active is the best antidote there is to climate anxiety and that sense of doom, is just how you get involved and how you can be active.
I love it. I love that you're such a great woman leading on climate and you're really pushing hard. It's really amazing to see what you're doing. So I always feel sad at the end of these interviews. I can't just be hanging out with you, having a glass of wine, just chilling out, talking about our kids, talking about climate, talking about life. But imagine we are. And I've got the stereo blaring, and I'm going to put, I say to you, Laura, what song do you want to put on?
So we'll be going, because of the age of my kids, and particularly my daughters, we've been going through a sort of real pop phase at the moment. So I think it would be Pink Pony Club by Chapel Roan. So we're listening to a lot of Olivia Rodrigo, a lot of Chapel Roan, a lot of Billie Eilish. So, but for a drink and a dance and letting your hair down, I think I'd go for that.
Amazing. I got remarried. I have now a 6-year-old, so 3 kids and a 6-year-old. So 6-year-old, we have a playlist, and you can imagine it's, I'm going back. Spice Girls actually come up with 6-year-old girls now too. So that's awesome. So you know what? When we do meet up, we're going to do that. We're going to have a drink and a dance.
We will.
All right.
Exactly. Lovely to see you. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Thanks, Laura. You've been listening to the Women Leading on Climate podcast. I'm your host, Catherine McKenna. Thanks to the McConnell Foundation for helping make this happen. And until next time, be brave, speak up, and keep on pushing forward on climate.